Flames of Bạch Đằng. Ngô Quyền sinks the invaders. The Red River flows wide and slow, carving its way through the heart of northern Vietnam. Its waters carry more than silt and rain. They carry memory. Long before it became a silent witness to one of Southeast Asia's most cunning military victories, the river was already etched into the soul of a people. It had seen dynasties rise and fall, invaders come and go, and villagers toil under the gaze of distant emperors. But in the year 938, the river would become a weapon, a line in the water where history turned. For over 1,000 years, Vietnam, then known as An Nam, had lived under the shadow of Chinese rule. From the Han dynasty's conquest in 111 BCE to the successive waves of Tang and Southern Han domination, the Vietnamese people endured a long and uneasy subjugation. Though periods of semi-autonomy and local leadership flared briefly, they were often crushed beneath the weight of distant emperors, imperial governors, and military expeditions. An Nam was viewed not as a sovereign land, but as a southern frontier, a rebellious province to be pacified, assimilated, or punished. By the early 10th century, the Tang dynasty in China was unraveling. Warlords rose and fell in chaotic succession. In the south, the short-lived Southern Han kingdom emerged from the ruins, clinging to influence across the Lingnan region and hungry to reassert its authority over the Red River Delta. Yet within Vietnam, a different tide was rising. The Vietnamese people, long denied the right to rule themselves, were beginning to shape their own destiny. And at the center of this growing independence stood one man, Ngô Quyền. Born into a turbulent world, Ngô Quyền had come of age as a military commander under Duong Dinh Nghe, a warlord who briefly asserted control over the north. When Duong was assassinated by a rival named Kieu Kung Tien, chaos threatened to consume the fragile autonomy the region had begun to taste. But Ngô Quyền, both son-in-law and loyal general of Duong, rose in response. He swiftly crushed Kieu's forces and claimed leadership for himself. However, in his desperation, Kieu had sent a plea for help to the Southern Han court in Guangzhou. It was a fatal mistake. The Southern Han, seizing the opportunity, launched an expedition to reassert control. Liu Yan, the king of Southern Han, ordered his son, Liu Hongkao, to lead a naval fleet southward, hundreds of ships sailing toward the Bạch Đằng River, carrying thousands of troops. This was no mere raid. It was a calculated reoccupation, a return to empire by force. But Ngô Quyền was not waiting to fight them in the open. He knew that Vietnamese armies could not match the Chinese fleet in a conventional battle. The Southern Han Navy was seasoned, supplied, and confident. Their vessels were heavy with soldiers, archers, and commanders who had grown used to putting down rebellions. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't have guessed, was that their greatest threat wasn't on land or even in battle formations. It was hidden beneath the water. Ngô Quyền had carefully studied the tides of the Bạch Đằng River. He understood its ebb and flow, its bottlenecks, and, most crucially, its shallows. In one of the most brilliant pre-modern examples of environmental warfare, he ordered hundreds of sharpened wooden stakes to be planted beneath the riverbed. At high tide, they were invisible. But as the tide receded, the stakes would emerge, creating a lethal field of impalement for any ship caught unaware. This was not simply military strategy. It was geographic genius, a deep understanding of terrain weaponized in a way few generals had ever attempted. As the Southern Han fleet approached, they believed they were entering a river controlled by an inferior opponent. They had no idea that Ngô Quyền had already turned the very landscape against them. The coming clash would be more than a battle. It would be a trap, centuries in the making. The Southern Han fleet cut through the Gulf of Tonkin like a blade through silk, its sails taut with wind, its decks bristling with armored soldiers. From the command ship, Liu Hongkao, son of King Liu Yan, surveyed the horizon with confidence. His orders were simple and proud: reassert imperial authority over the rebellious Vietnamese, punish the upstart Ngô Quyền, and re-establish control over the Red River Delta. For the Southern Han, this campaign was not merely military, it was symbolic. a chance to restore a vision of Chinese power stretching deep into the south. As the fleet approached the mouth of the Bạch Đằng River, the waters were calm and the skies deceptively clear. The river twisted inland, framed by marshes and forested banks, its muddy shallows veiling ancient secrets beneath the surface. Liu Hongkao believed that the war would be short, decisive, perhaps even glorious. After all, what resistance could a recently unified band of rebels truly offer to the might of the Southern Han Navy? What he could not see, what no commander in his place would suspect, was the hidden grid of sharpened wooden stakes, planted weeks earlier during low tide under Ngô Quyền direct supervision. Each stake was a meter tall and tipped with iron, driven deep into the riverbed at precise intervals, forming a deadly latticework designed to impale any ship trapped during the falling tide. It was not simply a physical barrier, it was psychological warfare hidden by the river's shifting surface. Ngô Quyền, meanwhile, waded inland with a smaller but fiercely disciplined force. Unlike Liu, he had no illusions. He understood the balance of power. His troops could not face the full might of the enemy fleet in open combat. What he possessed instead was time, terrain, and absolute knowledge of the river's behavior. His entire campaign hinged on a single, irreversible principle. The tide always turns. In the days leading up to the engagement, Ngô Quyền carefully orchestrated every movement. Local villagers were evacuated from the riverbanks. Lookouts were placed along the estuary to monitor the enemy's advance. Soldiers were drilled not just in combat, but in timing. The Vietnamese army would not fight at dawn or high noon. They would strike when nature itself became their ally. When Liu Hongkao's fleet began to move up the Bạch Đằng River, it encountered no resistance. Not a single arrow was loosed. Not a single torch signaled danger. It seemed as though Ngô Quyền had fled, or was preparing to sue for peace. The terrain narrowed as the fleet advanced, pressing the ships closer together, forcing them into a tighter formation. Still, there was no sign of enemy activity. The general atmosphere aboard the Southern Han ships shifted from caution to overconfidence. That was precisely what Ngô Quyền wanted. At a bend in the river, where the current slowed and the tide began to draw back, the trap was sprung. Vietnamese fireboats surged from behind the reeds. Archers on small, maneuverable vessels unleashed volleys from every direction. Hidden infantry on the shores rained down javelins and flaming arrows. The Southern Han fleet, boxed in by the narrowing river and the dropping tide, found itself in chaos. And then the stakes revealed themselves. As the tide receded, ships began to grind to a halt. Some broke their hulls open on the submerged spikes. Others became immobilized, trapped between the stakes and one another. Maneuverability collapsed. Panic spread. Officers barked orders that could not be followed. Crews abandoned ship, only to drown in the mud or be cut down by waiting Vietnamese forces. Ngô Quyền men pressed the advantage with surgical precision. They did not need to defeat the enemy in conventional formation. They needed only to sow confusion and let the river do the rest. Fires spread across the decks of the immobilized fleet. Masts collapsed. Soldiers leapt into the water only to find themselves ensnared by currents, reeds, or worse, the very stakes their commanders never saw coming. And in the heart of the maelstrom, Liu Hongkao fell. Accounts differ on whether he died in combat or drowned attempting to escape, but the result was the same. The commander of the Southern Han invasion was dead. The psychological blow to his army was devastating. Discipline evaporated. The fleet, what remained of it, was routed. Those who survived fled downstream, pursued relentlessly by Vietnamese boats. The river, once a pathway for conquest, had become a corridor of death. Bodies floated among the shattered ships. Cries for help echoed against the banks, drowned out by the crash of fire and tide. The great fleet that had set sail with such confidence returned in fragments, if it returned at all. Ngô Quyền did not merely win a battle. He delivered a message, not only to the Southern Han, but to every would-be conqueror. The Vietnamese were no longer a passive frontier. They had mastered their own land, their own rivers, their own fate. And the world would not forget what happened on the Bạch Đằng. As dawn broke over the delta, and smoke from the wrecked fleet still curled above the water, Ngô Quyền stood on the banks of the Bạch Đằng River, not just as a victorious general, but as something rarer, a man who had rewritten the course of his people's history in a single day. The battlefield behind him was not only strewn with broken ships and fallen soldiers, it was layered with centuries of imperial weight that had, until now, seemed immovable. With one decisive stroke, he had shattered the illusion of Chinese permanence in Annam. News of the Southern Han defeat raced across the region. Survivors, broken and humiliated, limped back to the Southern Han capital of Panyu, modern-day Guangzhou, carrying with them the weight of a catastrophe. Liu Yan, king of the Southern Han and father of the slain Liu Hongkao, was devastated. Though he initially planned a second invasion to avenge his son, the scale of the loss and the political instability it caused at home forced him to abandon the dream of reconquest. The once ambitious Southern Han court turned inward. It would never again attempt to subjugate Annam. For the Vietnamese, the victory was more than a military triumph. It was a psychological liberation. For a millennium, foreign domination had been the norm. Chinese dynasties had claimed authority over the land, dictating policy, reshaping administration, and enforcing tribute. While local leaders had occasionally wielded power, they did so as vassals, forever subordinate to the imperial court. Ngô Quyền broke that chain. He did not send tribute. He did not seek titles from a Chinese emperor. Instead, he declared himself king, Vung, not as a client ruler under the suzerainty of another court, but as the independent sovereign of an autonomous realm. This was not just a change in leadership, it was a redefinition of identity. For the first time in centuries, the Vietnamese had a ruler who governed in their name, on their soil, for their future. The capital was established at Co Loa, an ancient citadel north of present-day Hanoi. From this stronghold, Ngô Quyền began organizing his fledgling state, not as a mere confederation of warlords, but as a centralized kingdom. The shift from fractured regionalism to national unity was neither easy nor immediate, but the seeds had been sown. Administration, defense, and diplomacy were no longer dictated from across the northern border. They grew from Vietnamese ground, shaped by Vietnamese needs. This transition wasn't simply political, it was cultural. Freed from the weight of foreign orthodoxy, local scholars, poets, and thinkers began to examine what it meant to be Vietnamese. New forms of expression, regional dialects, and indigenous customs gained confidence. Confucian bureaucracy, long imported wholesale from China, began to blend with local traditions. A unique identity began to crystallize, one forged in resistance and solidified in blood. Ngô Quyền rule was brief. He died in 944, just 6 years after the battle. But the imprint he left on history was indelible. His death sparked a period of internal instability, with power struggles and competing factions. Yet even in the chaos that followed, no external power dared to reassert dominance. The psychological boundary he had created, a sense that this land was not merely a province but a country, held firm. Historians often speak of turning points, battles that changed borders, monarchs that shaped empires. But what Ngô Quyền accomplished at Bạch Đằng was something deeper. He turned a people into a nation, and he did it by fusing strategy with symbolism. His victory was not just about wooden stakes and title timing. It was a statement of ingenuity, a demonstration that the Vietnamese would not only fight back, but fight on their own terms, using their own land and their own minds. The Chinese chronicles recorded the loss with terse formality, but Vietnamese oral tradition preserved it as triumph. Songs were sung, stories passed down. Generations remembered that it was not iron swords or superior numbers that had saved their homeland. It was a river, a mind, and a refusal to bend. As the years passed, Ngô Quyền name became legend, not only as a general, but as the founder of Vietnamese independence. His legacy would echo in future generations through resistance against the Song, the Yuan, the Ming, and even the French. Each time a foreign power sought to impose its will, the memory of Bạch Đằng reminded the Vietnamese of what was possible. And each time, they looked to the river. The Bạch Đằng River did not forget, and neither did the people who lived along its muddy banks. Long after Ngô Quyền death, the waterway remained a symbol not just of victory, but of possibility. It was no longer just a strategic channel between sea and capital, but a living memorial to a nation's will. In time, the river would speak again, not in words, but in war. And when it did, it would once more carry the hopes of a people who had learned that terrain and timing, when harnessed with clarity, could overcome any empire. In the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire swept across Asia like wildfire. It had conquered from Korea to Hungary, from the Siberian tundra to the deserts of Persia. No force had stood against it successfully for long. But in Vietnam, now under the Tran dynasty, that fire met water and was doused. The Mongol invasions of Dai Viet, as Vietnam was now called, were brutal. In 1257, 1285, and again in 1287, waves of Mongol forces attempted to subjugate the small kingdom. The second and third invasions were the most intense, launched under the rule of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and founder of the Yuan dynasty in China. Determined to bring Dai Viet into the fold of Mongol vassal states, Kublai dispatched fleets and armies with overwhelming numbers. But the Vietnamese had not forgotten the lessons of the past. Leading the resistance was Tran Hung Dao, a prince, general, and strategist revered for his intellect and restraint. Like Ngô Quyền before him, Tran Hung Dao understood that brute strength could not win the war. The Mongols were too numerous, too experienced. What he possessed instead was an inheritance of strategy and an intimate understanding of how his ancestors had turned nature into a battlefield. In 1288, at the same Bạch Đằng River where Ngô Quyền had struck a century before, Tran Hung Dao laid his trap. Once again, wooden stakes were driven into the riverbed. Once again, timing was critical. Once again, the enemy was lured into the narrow waterway with the tide rising behind them. And once again, as the tide withdrew and the fleet became entangled among the submerged spikes, Vietnamese forces attacked with precision, turning chaos into victory. The parallels were more than tactical. They were intentional homage. Tran Hung Dao invoked the memory of Ngô Quyền openly, framing his own defense of the homeland as a continuation of the legacy forged in 938. It was not just good strategy, it was nation-building through memory. Bạch Đằng, then, became more than a place. It became an idea, a reminder that independence was never permanent, but always earned, and that geography could be weaponized when wielded by those who knew its rhythms. In both 938 and 1288, invaders had come expecting to dominate. Both had left shattered and humiliated, their ships wrecked not by iron or fire alone, but by the land and water themselves. This dual legacy, Ngô Quyền and Tran Hung Dao, formed a mythic foundation for Vietnam's sense of self. It showed that even the greatest empires could fall when confronted by a people who knew their own terrain better than any map. It demonstrated the power of strategic patience, of waiting for the moment when every element, man, river, and tide, aligned. In the centuries that followed, Bạch Đằng would be evoked during every great national crisis. When resisting the Ming in the 15th century, or confronting French colonial expansion in the 19th, Vietnamese leaders and thinkers recalled the lessons of the river. Poems and chronicles told and retold the tale of how a clever general and a changing tide had reshaped history. And not just in military terms, the river also carried metaphor. It represented the fluid nature of power, the ability of a smaller force to move and adapt, and the idea that resilience, like water, can erode even the hardest stone. Vietnamese folklore, too, was enriched by the imagery. In songs, plays, and temple inscriptions, Bạch Đằng became a living character, a sacred space where the nation's spirit had once risen and would rise again. Modern historians debate many details about the battle: the number of stakes, the exact location of ambush points, the role of auxiliary units. Archaeologists have unearthed remnants of wooden piles in the Bạch Đằng estuary, validating much of the narrative that had once been passed down only by word of mouth and dynastic records. But the core truth remains undisputed. In 938, Ngô Quyền did not just repel an invasion. He launched a tradition, a uniquely Vietnamese approach to warfare, leadership, and sovereignty. One that prized adaptation over force, terrain over numbers, and the patience to wait for the perfect moment. In doing so, he taught future generations that the line between defeat and freedom was not always written by armies, but sometimes by rivers. The defeat of the Southern Han on the Bạch Đằng River had sent a resounding message far beyond the battlefield. But as Ngô Quyền stepped into his role not only as a victorious general, but as the de facto ruler of An Nam, he faced a challenge even more daunting than foreign conquest: the unification of a deeply fragmented land. Victory had earned him the throne, but it had not erased the divisions among the local clans, warlords, and aristocratic families who had long operated as semi-autonomous powers in their respective regions. An Nam in the 10th century was not a centralized state with clear borders and institutions. It was a tapestry of competing interests, regional loyalties, and lingering fear of retribution from the Chinese north. Ngô Quyền had liberated his people from foreign rule, but now he had to convince them they were a people at all. His first move was symbolic but bold. He relocated the political center of his realm to Koh Loa, a city that carried deep historical resonance. Once the capital of the ancient Âu Lạc kingdom centuries earlier, Koh Loa had served as a seat of Vietnamese autonomy before Chinese conquest. By choosing it as his capital, Ngô Quyền linked his rule to the mythic past, projecting continuity and legitimacy. It was a powerful statement. The Vietnamese were not starting anew, they were returning to themselves. From Koh Loa, he began to consolidate power, not by brute force, but through strategic alliances and calculated tolerance. He allowed many local lords to maintain their domains under his nominal authority, provided they recognized his kingship. It was a delicate balance: assert too much control and risk rebellion, offer too little, and the kingdom would fracture again. Ngô Quyền political instincts were as sharp as his military ones. He governed with enough firmness to assert dominance, but with enough restraint to maintain fragile unity. His administrative reforms, though limited by the era's logistical constraints, focused on stabilizing the countryside. He oversaw the appointment of regional officials, the collection of taxes, and the maintenance of public infrastructure, especially dikes and irrigation systems critical to rice cultivation. In doing so, he built not just a monarchy, but the early foundations of a state, one rooted in agrarian prosperity and mutual obligation between ruler and ruled. Still, the threats to his rule were not merely external or structural, they were deeply personal. The death of a charismatic unifier often invites chaos, and Ngô Quyền knew that his own passing could unravel the very fabric he had woven. To forestall this, he declared his son, Ngô Quyền, as successor. But succession in a feudal and semi-tribal society was rarely smooth. Indeed, after Ngô Quyền death in 944, his vision of a stable dynasty collapsed almost immediately. The power vacuum was seized by a former general and court official named Duong Tam Kha, who usurped the throne and exiled the rightful heir. Though Ngô Quyền would later reclaim part of his inheritance, the period that followed was marked by instability, infighting, and the slow unraveling of central authority. The kingdom Ngô Quyền had labored to build slipped into a patchwork of rival states and competing warlords once more. This era, known in Vietnamese history as the Anarchy of the 12 Warlords, would last for decades, a grim reminder of how fragile sovereignty can be when unbacked by lasting institutions. But even in that fragmentation, Ngô Quyền victory at Bạch Đằng remained a guiding myth, a collective memory of what could be achieved when unity was forged from division. His legacy was not measured solely by the length of his reign or the permanence of his dynasty. It lived on in the idea that Vietnam could govern itself, defend itself, and define itself. No longer a mere outpost of Chinese civilization, the land between the mountains and the sea was now a political and cultural entity in its own right. Centuries later, Vietnamese chroniclers would look back on Ngo Quyen not just as a king, but as a founder, the first true sovereign of an independent Vietnam. He had not inherited a throne or built upon a stable foundation. He had seized history with both hands, wrested it from the jaws of empire, and carved a new path forward. His battlefield was muddy and narrow, but his vision stretched far beyond the riverbanks. The stakes driven into the Bạch Đằng River were more than instruments of war. They were monuments, silent, submerged, and enduring. And even as his kingdom splintered after his death, those stakes continued to speak of a moment when the tide turned, not just for one battle, but for an entire people. In the long annals of military history, some victories are measured in territory gained or cities captured. Others are measured in ideas, tactics so innovative that they alter the very assumptions of how war is fought. Ngo Quyen's triumph at Bạch Đằng belongs firmly in the latter category. His use of the river not just as a battlefield, but as an instrument of warfare introduced a new model of asymmetric strategy, one that would reverberate throughout Vietnam's martial philosophy for generations. The brilliance of Ngo Quyen's defense lay not only in his mastery of terrain, but in his rejection of conventional confrontation. While the Southern Han brought superior numbers and traditional naval formation, Ngo Quyen chose fluidity over formality, deception over strength, and timing over force. He was, in effect, fighting not just a foreign army, but the very expectations of how warfare in the 10th century was supposed to unfold. Asymmetric warfare, as it would later be termed, is the art of turning weakness into advantage. It thrives when one side lacks the manpower, technology, or resources to meet an enemy on equal terms. Instead, it weaponizes the unexpected. It relies on mobility, deception, terrain, morale, and most importantly, knowing when not to fight. Ngo Quyen's strategy exemplified these principles to perfection. He avoided open engagement when the tide was high and the enemy confident. He drew them into a funnel, let their assumptions guide their path, and then timed his ambush to coincide with the river's natural cycle. The stakes, hidden at high tide and lethal at low, were not simply defensive structures. They were metaphors for the deeper ethos of Vietnamese resistance, patient, concealed, and devastating when revealed. This approach would become a cornerstone of Vietnam's military identity. Over the next 1,000 years, Vietnam would face multiple invasions from vastly larger and more powerful empires: Mongols, Ming, Qing, French, Japanese, and Americans. And in nearly every case, Vietnamese resistance drew upon the templacy Ngo Quyen had pioneered, using terrain, patience, and adaptability to blunt superior might. Even during the 20th century wars against France and the United States, the Vietnamese revolutionary leadership, particularly General Von Nguyen Giap, studied and celebrated past masters like Ngo Quyen and Tran Hung Dao. Giap, who orchestrated the defeat of French forces at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, famously declared that People's War was rooted in the same strategic DNA as Bạch Đằng. He understood that victory did not require matching firepower, but rather manipulating context so that firepower could not be effectively applied. The stakes in the river became the jungle trails of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the village networks of the Mekong Delta, the cave systems of Quang Tri. The principle was consistent: control the environment, and you control the war. Beyond strategy, Ngo Quyen's battle influenced the psychological posture of Vietnamese defense. It instilled a national confidence that even the greatest empires could be defeated, not with overwhelming strength, but with superior understanding. This legacy shaped the morale of countless resistance movements, turning historical memory into a weapon of its own. The cultural echoes of Bạch Đằng also manifested in Vietnam's art and literature. Folk poems memorialized the stakes as symbols of cunning and bravery. Temples were built near the riverbanks in reverence. In schools, the story of Ngo Quyen was taught not only as history, but as identity, proof that a smaller nation could resist domination if it had clarity of purpose and mastery of its own landscape. For historians, the challenge has always been separating legend from reality. How many stakes were used? Where exactly were they placed? How large was the invading fleet? While archaeological discoveries in the 20th and 21st centuries have uncovered rows of ancient wooden stakes in the Bạch Đằng estuary, the broader truth lies not in numbers, but in impact. The battle's genius wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. It taught that even in a world of empire and subjugation, agency could be reclaimed. That knowledge of home, its rivers, rhythms, and history, could outmatch foreign discipline and imperial might. It suggested that sovereignty begins not with the sword, but with strategy. In this way, Ngô Quyền joined the ranks of history's great tacticians, not as a conqueror, but as a defender who redefined the limits of defense. His was not the legacy of expanding borders, but of drawing lines that no enemy could cross without consequence. A river, a tide, a people who would not yield. And so, Bạch Đằng lives on, not merely as a past event, but as a living doctrine, one that whispers to every would-be aggressor, the water you sail may hide more than current. It may remember, though the Battle of Bạch Đằng secured independence from the Southern Han, it did not deliver lasting unity. The tide that Ngô Quyền had turned was political as well as military, and tides, by their nature, are cyclical. No sooner had the Chinese threat receded than new tensions swelled within. The great challenge Ngô Quyền left behind was not how to repel invaders, but how to build a nation capable of surviving in peace. After his death in 944, the fragile architecture of the state he had forged began to fracture. His appointed heir, Ngô Quyền was quickly pushed aside by Dung Tam Kha, a relative by marriage who seized power in a swift political coup. The usurpation shocked the nascent Vietnamese court. While Dung Tam Kha claimed to rule in the name of the Ngô family, he ruled in practice as a despot, undermining the legitimacy Ngô Quyền had carefully built. The court at Koh Loa splintered. Regional lords, emboldened by the breakdown of central authority, began to assert autonomy. Loyalties became fluid. Old clan rivalries re-emerged. Local strongmen raised private armies, collected taxes independently, and declared their own titles. The country, barely unified for a decade, began slipping into feudal disintegration. Though Ngô Quyền eventually returned to power alongside his brother, Ngô Quyền, their co-rule was marred by infighting and weak central control. Upon their deaths, the kingdom fully collapsed into what later historians termed Lone Thap Ni Sukwon, the anarchy of the 12 warlords. This term, though convenient, only partially captures the nature of the crisis. In reality, there were more than 12 contenders. Some held territory for mere months, others for years. The map of Dai Co Viet, the early Vietnamese state, became a mosaic of mini-states, each with its own ambitions. Civil war engulfed the land. Peasants bore the brunt, pressed into militias, overtaxed or displaced entirely. The euphoria of Bạch Đằng gave way to exhaustion and despair. And yet, amid the fragmentation, the memory of Ngô Quyền endured like a lighthouse in a storm. His name was evoked by warlords to legitimize their cause. His battlefield was cited as the birthplace of the nation, a symbol of what could be reclaimed. Even those who fought each other often claimed to defend his legacy, demonstrating the depth of his impact on the Vietnamese political imagination. Eventually, order was restored, not by Ngô bloodline, but by a new leader, Dinh Bo Linh, a warlord from Hoa Lu. Known for his tactical brilliance and personal charisma, Dinh Bo Linh systematically subdued rival factions through both warfare and diplomacy. He understood the symbolic power of unity, and once he had consolidated control, he crowned himself Emperor Dinh Tiên Hoàng in 968, officially founding the Dai Co Viet dynasty, the first Vietnamese monarchy to bear the imperial title. In doing so, he built directly on the precedent Ngô Quyền had set. The very idea that Vietnam could and should be ruled independently, free from Chinese suzerainty, had been made real at Bạch Đằng. Ngô Quyền example had proved that foreign domination was not inevitable. and that unity, though fleeting, was worth fighting for. Yet Din Bolin's consolidation did not erase the scars of the previous decades. The institutions of governance remained weak. Succession crises loomed. External threats, from both the Song dynasty to the north and Champa to the south, remained ever present. Still, the conceptual foundation of Vietnam as a sovereign state had been laid, and it could be traced directly to the battle in 938. In this way, Ngô Quyền legacy extended beyond tactics and triumph. It became a political North Star, guiding future rulers, even amid chaos, toward the goal of national coherence. His river victory had not just altered geopolitics, it had created a vision of Vietnamese sovereignty that persisted even in times when sovereignty itself seemed to falter. By the 11th century, Vietnam would evolve into a more centralized state under the Le and Tran dynasties. But the foundational myth of Bạch Đằng continued to serve a vital purpose. It reminded kings and scholars, generals and peasants alike, that their independence had not been granted, it had been earned, and that it could just as easily be lost should they fail to guard it with vigilance. Thus, in the centuries after his death, Ngô Quyền stood less as a figure of nostalgia and more as a warning and a guidepost. A victorious founder whose empire fell apart not from invasion, but from within. His triumph had shown what unity could achieve. His death and the chaos that followed showed what disunity could destroy. The stakes that once pierced the hulls of Southern handships now seemed to stand against the Vietnamese themselves. Reminders that without discipline, vision, and shared purpose, even the most glorious victories could sink beneath the tides. As centuries passed, the muddy banks of the Bạch Đằng River remained quiet. The tides still rose and fell, the water still flowed to the sea, but the stakes, long rotted or buried beneath silt, were no longer visible. And yet, the battle that had taken place there in 938 did not fade. Instead, it grew larger in the national imagination. What had begun as a strategic military triumph became something greater, a mythic cornerstone of Vietnamese identity. The transformation began not long after Ngô Quyền death. Early Vietnamese court historians, despite the turmoil of the anarchy of the 12 warlords, included accounts of the battle in state chronicles. Oral traditions helped preserve and embellish the story, often with details that blurred the line between history and heroism. Ngô Quyền was not merely remembered, he was enshrined. In the absence of a lasting dynasty, his victory became the continuity that later rulers anchored themselves to. By the 11th century, under the Le dynasty, Vietnam had stabilized enough to begin fostering a more formal cultural identity. Scholars at the royal court compiled the first historical annals of the nation. Among them was the Dai Viet Su Ki, the precursor to later works like Dai Viet Su Ki Tuan Tu. These texts treated the Battle of Bạch Đằng as the symbolic dawn of Vietnamese sovereignty, an origin point as important as any royal coronation. Ngô Quyền was elevated in status, not only as a general or a king, but as the founder of independence, a mantle no ruler dared to ignore. Temples were built in his honor, especially near the site of the battle. Worship of Ngô Quyền as a tutelary spirit, a common tradition in Vietnamese religious culture, blended Confucian respect for virtuous rulers with indigenous spiritual reverence. Fishermen and boatmen offered incense at shrines along the river, not only to honor the past, but to ask for protection from the very waters that had once run red with war. The river itself, too, took on sacred dimensions. No longer simply a waterway, Bạch Đằng became a symbol of resilience, of strategic genius, and of national unity in the face of foreign domination. Vietnamese poets, especially during the Tran dynasty, drew upon its imagery to invoke patriotic themes. One of the most famous poems, Phu Sông Bạch Đằng, by Trung Han Siu in the 14th century, paints the river not just as a setting for battle, but as a living witness to greatness. The poem's lines blend awe, sorrow, and pride, reflecting a culture that saw in Bạch Đằng the soul of its history. This poetic tradition continued well into the early modern era. Scholars and commoners alike invoked the battle to remind themselves, and each other, that Vietnam had a long tradition of standing against empires. Under French colonial rule in the 19th and 20th centuries, nationalist thinkers often turned back to the story of Ngo Quyền as proof that Vietnamese resistance had deep ancient roots. In speeches, pamphlets, and underground education, Bạch Đằng became more than a memory. It became a call to action. During the First Indochina War and the Vietnam War, revolutionary leaders again evoked the name. In 1954, after the stunning Vietnamese victory over French forces at Dien Bien Phu, comparisons were drawn between General Vo Nguyen Giap and Ngo Quyền. Both had achieved the impossible, one with stakes in a river, the other with trenches in the hills. Both had used terrain and patience to turn inferiority into strength. It is no coincidence that Ho Chi Minh, in building a new national consciousness, often included references to Vietnam's long resistance history. The tale of Bạch Đằng reminded people that they were not simply reacting to modern oppression, but continuing a story that had begun more than 1,000 years earlier. In schools, textbooks summarized NgoQuien's achievement, but they rarely did it justice. The classroom could not fully convey how deeply this one moment had shaped the Vietnamese collective psyche. That role fell instead to family stories, local legends, and community rituals. Even children who could not yet read might know that, long ago, a king placed stakes in the river and stopped an empire. In the late 20th century, as Vietnam sought to reconnect with its ancient heritage after decades of war and division, the Bạch Đằng battlefield became a site of national pilgrimage. Archaeological digs uncovered actual rows of wooden stakes preserved by mud and water, confirming much of what had long been passed down by word and song. Museums were built, commemorations were held, but nothing could compare to standing on the riverbank itself, feeling the current rush past, and imagining the moment when ships, soldiers, and history itself had been caught in the tide. Today, Bạch Đằng is not merely remembered, it is lived. In festivals, in school essays, in the hearts of a people who have had to fight for their place in the world again and again, its message endures. That freedom is never given, it is seized with courage, cunning, and unwavering resolve. And in that message lies the reason why Bạch Đằng was never just a battle. It was, and remains, the river where Vietnam found itself. In the centuries after the tide of Bạch Đằng had swallowed the fleets of empire, NgoQuien's legacy did not stay confined to the annals of Vietnamese history. It became a lens through which future generations, within Vietnam and beyond, grappled with questions of leadership, sovereignty, and the complex balance between might and legitimacy. Vietnamese rulers across dynasties frequently looked to Ngo Quyền, not only as a founder of independence, but as a model of how to wield power with vision. His approach to warfare, to governance, and to state-building set precedents that outlived his short reign. In contrast to many conquerors who are remembered for expansion, Ngo Quyền greatness lay in defining limits, setting boundaries against foreign domination, and constructing an internal identity around resilience rather than conquest. This made him a foundational figure for dynasties that sought to solidify their own claims to power. The Lý dynasty, 1009-2005, often considered the first fully consolidated Vietnamese monarchy, invoked Ngo Quyền example to justify its emphasis on centralized rule and cultural distinction from China. The dynasty promoted Buddhism, a local form of Confucian governance, and celebrated historical victories as part of a growing national consciousness. At the heart of this ideology was the idea that Vietnam had always been capable of self-rule, beginning with Bạch Đằng. The Tran dynasty, 1225-1400, elevated this even further, embedding the Ngo legacy within its wartime ethos. When the Mongol Yuan dynasty launched multiple invasions, Tran leaders made explicit connections to the Bạch Đằng victory, even replicating its tactics in 1288 under Tran Hung Dao. In doing so, they not only secured military success, they cultivated a historical narrative of continuous defiance, anchored in the precedent set by Ngo Quyền, But it was not only in Vietnam where the ripples of his strategy reached. In neighboring Southeast Asian states, Champa, Cambodia, Siam, rulers faced similar tensions, navigating between powerful empires while maintaining autonomy. Ngo Queen's example stood out as a rare and early case where a smaller, fragmented polity had decisively defeated an imperial navy through ingenuity rather than size. Though not always directly referenced in foreign chronicles, his impact was indirectly felt through the rise of regional doctrines emphasizing terrain, mobility, and adaptability. Tactics particularly useful in the riverine, jungle-covered landscapes of the region. Ngo Quyen also helped shape the philosophical foundations of what it meant to be a legitimate ruler in Vietnam. His right to rule did not come from birth into a long dynasty, nor from divine mandate in the Confucian sense, but from his demonstrated ability to protect the people and secure their independence. In this way, he represented a meritocratic ideal that leadership was earned through service and sacrifice, not inherited through blood alone. This concept proved enduring, especially during later periods of foreign rule. Under Ming occupation in the 15th century, resistance leaders like Lê Loi invoked Ngo Quyen's name when rallying support. When Lê Loi defeated the Ming and founded the Lê dynasty, his court historians positioned him as a spiritual and strategic heir to Ngo Quyen, drawing parallels between their triumphs as liberators. The echoes grew louder in the modern era. When Vietnam came under French colonial rule in the 19th century, nationalist scholars resurrected Ngo Quyen as a symbol of authentic Vietnamese sovereignty. He became a centerpiece in the intellectual struggle to reclaim history from colonial narratives that dismissed Vietnamese civilization as perpetually subservient to larger powers. Revolutionary writers, seeking to instill pride and resistance in an oppressed population, wrote impassioned accounts of Bạch Đằng, placing it alongside global moments of anti-colonial defiance. And in the 20th century, both in the north and south of a divided Vietnam, the name Ngo Quyen was politically potent. Streets, schools, and districts were named in his honor across ideologies. His legacy became common ground, a rare symbol of unity in a country repeatedly torn by war and ideology. While communist leaders often emphasized class struggle and modern revolution, even they revered Ngo Quyen as the father of independence. His battlefield tactics might have belonged to the 10th century, but his message remained timeless. Foreign domination was never destiny. Beyond politics and warfare, Ngo Quyen's story has also shaped Vietnamese identity in subtler ways. In literature, theater, and visual art, the image of stakes rising from the river recurs as a metaphor for unseen strength and deep-rooted resolve. Children learn his name as early as they learn their alphabet. To know Ngo Quyen is not just to know history, it is to understand what it means to be Vietnamese. Today, in an era of global interconnectedness, when Vietnam balances international partnerships with national interests, the story of Bạch Đằng still whispers its caution. It reminds leaders and citizens alike that sovereignty, once gained, is never permanent unless continually defended, not always by war, but through unity, clarity, and memory. The wooden stakes have long since decayed, but the ideas they anchored remain. In rivers, in mines, in policies, Ngo Quyen's victory lives on. Not as nostalgia, but as foundation. More than 1,000 years have passed since the tide turned at Bạch Đằng. The stakes that once ripped through southern Han ships now rest quietly beneath layers of river silt, like forgotten bones. Yet the battle they shaped, and the man who orchestrated it, remain vivid, not only in Vietnamese history, but in the broader human narrative of how the powerless resist the powerful. Ngo Quyen's victory was not just a military feat. It was a revolution in strategic thinking, a declaration that knowledge, adaptability, and timing could trump raw force. In a world that still wrestles with asymmetry, where smaller states face superpowers, where local communities resist centralized control, where technological and cultural shifts reshape the nature of power, Bạch Đằng is as relevant now as it was in 938. His use of the river's rhythm, of wooden stakes hidden until the decisive moment, was a masterclass in understanding one's environment. Today, strategists call this terrain dominance or contextual warfare. Ngô Quyền lived it before those terms ever existed. He didn't merely react to the enemy, he designed the conditions in which the enemy would defeat itself. And in doing so, he turned a tactical trick into a geopolitical turning point. For modern nations, especially those navigating between global giants, the lesson is clear. Sovereignty isn't about outgunning your opponent. It's about knowing where you stand, what you control, and when to act. It's about patience, foresight, and the courage to wait until the tide favors you. Ngô Quyền also offers a model of leadership grounded in purpose, not legacy. He didn't inherit his power. He earned it through vision, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief in his people's right to rule themselves. His success wasn't built on conquest, but on liberation. He had no desire to expand Vietnam beyond its natural bounds. Instead, he drew a line and declared it worth defending. That kind of leadership, clear-eyed, restrained, but resolute, is rare in any century. There's also a profound cultural legacy to consider. In resisting a centuries-old pattern of domination, Ngô Quyền didn't just win a war, he helped shape a national consciousness, a belief that Vietnamese identity was something distinct, precious, and unbreakable. He transformed geography into symbol. After Bạch Đằng, rivers became more than trade routes. They became guardians of the homeland. In an age when borders are often drawn by treaties, not tides, and where sovereignty is challenged not only by armies, but by markets, media, and machines, the symbolic power of Bạch Đằng still holds. It tells us that identity must be defended with both intellect and courage, that memory and imagination are as essential as soldiers and steel. For Vietnam, Bạch Đằng is the beginning of the story, but not the end. It resurfaces in every chapter, when Tran Hung Dao defeated the Mongols with similar tactics in the 13th century, when Lê Loi cast off Ming domination in the 15th, when Nguyen Hue stunned Qing forces at the dawn of the 19th, and in more recent times, when small Vietnamese forces challenged global superpowers with the same spirit of strategic defiance. But perhaps most importantly, Bạch Đằng teaches that freedom is a choice renewed, not a gift remembered. Each generation must find its own stakes, its own river, its own moment to stand firm. Whether through politics, culture, or innovation, the challenge remains the same. How to preserve autonomy without isolation. How to protect identity without closing the door to the world. Ngô Quyền never set out to become a legend. He was a man confronting an empire, leading a people too long denied their voice. His victory was born not of grandeur, but of grit, of knowing his river, his enemy, and his moment. And for all its echoes through history, perhaps that is the truest lesson Bạch Đằng offers. That greatness lies not in the size of one's army, but in the clarity of one's cause. That leadership is not about holding power, but about giving a people back their name. So when we look at the silt-covered stakes or the placid water that once ran red, we see more than history. We see a mirror. And we are asked, as Ngô Quyền once was, will you know your river when the tide turns? And that brings our journey down the Bạch Đằng River to a close, a story of stakes, strategy, and a nation's first stand for its own name. What did this moment in history mean to you? Do you see echoes of Ngô Quyền wisdom in how smaller nations navigate power today? Or perhaps it made you reflect on how history is shaped, not only by empires, but by those bold enough to resist them? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, consider giving the video a like and sharing it with others who appreciate the depth and drama of world history. And if you want more journeys like this one, subscribe for future episodes from the front lines of the past. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may you always know when the tide is turning.